Next, we're going to get into evolutionary history, the history of the universe and the history of life on Earth. And this includes a lot of branches of science. The origin of the universe falls into the realm of mostly astronomy. The origin of the Earth falls into mostly the realm of geology, and the origin of life on Earth, it includes a little astronomy and some geology, good bit of chemistry, and then biology and evolution. And the origin of life on Earth is referred to as abiogenesis or chemical evolution. And we'll get into how exactly it happened a little bit later. And this is an area of evolution where we don't know exactly what happened because chemicals don't fossilize very well. But we have a good idea what did happen because of the chemicals we see in our cells today. So, how life originated on Earth falls into the realm of scientific speculation. We can come up with natural explanations for what could have happened. And there are several, and we'll get into those. And it's scientific speculation because there's not a whole lot of evidence to show that what we think happened actually happened. And there are several ideas about how life could have originated, and one or more of them could have happened, or something could have happened we haven't thought about yet. So first, a little bit about the origin of the universe. The universe is between 13 and 16 billion years old. At the beginning of that time, there was an explosion we refer to as the Big Bang. What caused it? What were conditions like before the Big Bang? Could we even talk about what conditions were like before the Big Bang? Because time started at the Big Bang, and before the Big Bang there wasn't time. So can we really talk about what happened before the Big Bang? This is an area of scientific speculation that falls into an astronomy class. And we're briefly mentioning it in this class. And we don't really know what happened. Kind of like with the origin of life, we have a number of ideas of what might have happened, but we really don't know. And there are a number of religious answers. Various religions have various ideas about how the universe originated or what started the Big Bang. These are supernatural explanations for how the universe got started, and that's different classes. That doesn't fall into the context of science classes. So, the universe originated somewhere between 13 and 16 billion years ago. Then galaxies and stars formed. And then about 5 or so billion years ago, in one particular area of our galaxy, there was a dust cloud. And gravity caused this dust cloud to collapse. And most of the matter in that dust cloud collapsed into an object so big and heavy or massive that atoms were squeezed together and nuclear fusion started. That's how our sun was born. And the leftover stuff in that dust cloud became planets. And how do we know this? How do we know this happened? We can look around us at the universe and the galaxy, and we see lots of dust clouds, and we can see other planetary systems and different stages of formation, or more so, other stars and different stages of formation. And we can see what's happening in other places in our galaxy, and we have a good idea the same thing was happening here. Again, that falls into the realm more of an astronomy class. So one of those leftover bits of that dust cloud, most of which turned into the sun, became the Earth. And little particles congealed in bigger particles, and they stuck together and became the planet Earth. And then later, there's liquid water after things cooled off enough. This was somewhere around 4 billion or so years ago. And there was no oxygen. Why was there no oxygen? Where does almost all of today's oxygen come from? Photosynthesis. So the early Earth, the atmosphere, the water had a different chemistry than it does today. One thing oxygen does is it breaks down biochemicals. It's rather corrosive. And organic chemicals that we're developing weren't broken down. No oxygen, no ozone. So what was sunlight energy on the surface of the Earth like? It was much, much more intense. And this energy from the sun that wasn't blocked probably may have powered the formation of early life on Earth. The atmosphere had a lot of ammonia, methane, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide. How do we know this? We know this because of various astronomical and geologic reasons. Can't get into that here. So, inorganic chemicals, like the ones I just mentioned, turned into organic chemicals. And the organic chemicals turned into biochemicals. This is easy to do. We can do it in a few months in the lab. And then sometime later, probably somewhere close to 4 billion years ago, protocells developed. Droplets of phospholipids started forming. And you can see what happens in a figure on this slide. When you mix phospholipids in with water, they form little droplets of this, little droplets like this. And does that remind you of anything? Remember the structure of cell membranes made up of phospholipid bilayers? It started forming cell-like environments where the inside of these protocells was different than the outside. And those phospholipids were semi-permeable. Some chemicals could enter the cells, but others couldn't. And the inside of the cell started becoming different than the outside. Inorganic chemicals turned into nucleotides, the building blocks of nucleic acids. And again, this is easy to do in the lab. We can take inorganic chemicals, add an energy source, and have them turn into nucleic acids. And looking at how nucleic acids work today, we think the first ones were probably RNA enzymes called ribozymes. They started replicating, and during that replication process, some changes occurred and they stuck together and DNA formed. And what are the differences between DNA and RNA? There's a picture on the right here. DNA is a little bit more complicated. It's double-stranded. RNA is single-stranded. There's a different sugar in DNA called deoxyribose, and one of the nucleic acids is different. So we went from RNA, which was the first nucleic acid, eventually to DNA. And these moved into protocells. The DNA replicated. The DNA formed RNA, which formed proteins, and the proteins carried out the functions of cells. So that's probably how the first genetic material formed. And how this happened, where it happened, there are a lot of good ideas about this we'll get into later. Also, inorganic chemicals turned into amino acids. Amino acids attach to each other and form proteins. And there are 20 different proteins in our cells. And again, this is easy to replicate in laboratories. We've taken inorganic chemicals, added energy to it, and they formed organic chemicals. So these steps, going especially from inorganic chemicals to biochemicals, are easy to replicate in the lab. It's been done many times. So all you need is inorganic chemicals, an energy source, time, and various formulations of the inorganic chemicals have been tried, mimicking what the early Earth was probably like, and biochemicals resulted. And we can easily make DNA, proteins, and nucleotides this way. And carbohydrates. Lipids are a little more difficult. And then once these ended up in cell membranes and cells, they started replicating, and evolution could take over. And life developed from there. So when did this happen? The Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. We know that because of numerous sources of radioactive dating. The first fossils we see in the fossil record are bacteria. We've seen evidence of them going back to 3.8 billion years, and we've actually seen fossil bacteria going back to 3.5 billion years. And some of the first earliest forms of life on Earth were cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. Now at the top of this figure, you can see what are called stromatolites. These bacteria, they grow in layers and layers and layers, and the bottom layers, they mineralize and turn into rocks. And we can see these exact same structures. They're 3.5 billion years old. So we can actually see bacteria fossils that go back to 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. So sometime around 4 billion years ago, life formed. And then we start seeing the first fossils. Where did this occur? That's an area of scientific speculation. Could have been in tidal pools near shores where these chemicals could be brought close together. Probably didn't happen in open oceans. The chemicals would be too dilute. Maybe wet sand. maybe near volcanic vents underwater, and then geologic activity, heat would provide the energy source. And you can see one of these underwater volcanic vents on the bottom right. The first organic chemicals, biochemicals, could have been carried onto Earth through meteorites and comets. We actually see amino acids and carbohydrates in meteorites and comets. They're forming in space. Could these biochemicals, could the earliest life have formed somewhere else? Someplace else we haven't thought of? Could it have been more than one of the above? And we're not really sure. But after life formed, we have a pretty good idea what happened because of the fossil record. Some of the major events in the history of life on Earth. The first prokaryote showed up about 4 billion years ago, including cyanobacteria, which underwent photosynthesis that added oxygen to the atmosphere. We could see changes in rocks around 2.7 billion years ago that indicated there was more and more oxygen in the atmosphere. And then looking at rocks, we can see that these oxygen levels rose pretty quickly about 2.2 billion years ago. Then we see eukaryotes in the fossil record. Single-celled organisms with nuclei and membrane-bound organelles, a bit more complicated than the prokaryotes or bacteria. And where did they come from? Well, the only thing that existed from 4 billion years ago to about 2 billion years ago on Earth were bacteria. So eukaryotic cells had to come from prokaryotes. And do you remember endosymbiosis? Organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts, they used to be independently living prokaryotes. They started living inside of bigger prokaryotes, and then these smaller ones became organelles. And today they still have bacteria-like DNA and ribosomes, which indicates they used to be independently living bacteria. Also, organelles like the endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus may have come from membranes of prokaryotes that became highly folded, like in the top figure. And these folds pinched off and became separate organelles. Then about 1.5 billion years ago, we see in the fossil record multicellular life. We see organisms that resemble today's colonial algae and multicellular algae. Colonial cells is kind of intermediate between being single-celled and multicellular. The cells just happen to be attached to each other, but they're mostly doing their own thing. In multicellular organisms, the cells have a distinct division of labor and different cells do different things. And you can see, especially on the bottom right figure, some colonial algae. Then about 0.575 billion years ago, we see larger, more complex multicellular organisms, including animals. We can see in the fossil record, first some softer animals like jellyfish, and then later animals with harder shells and harder parts like arthropods. Then Cambrian explosion occurred between 535 and 525 million years ago. And we call it an explosion because instead of having just maybe a few dozen species of organisms, we suddenly see hundreds of species of organisms, including all animal phyla. And animal phyla include chordates, which include vertebrates like us. Another phylum, there's arthropods, which includes insects and trilobites and spiders. We see all of those animal phyla. Chordates include the phylum we belong to. Plus, there are several extinct phyla that were present at the time. Now, an example of a chordate, that's an invertebrate. You can see this figure on the bottom right, and it's called an amphioxus or lancelet. And there were invertebrates living about this time that kind of look like that. It belonged to the phylum Chordata. So there were dozens of species that suddenly showed up in the fossil record, maybe even hundreds of species. And before that, there weren't that many species. I've heard some people say before the Cambrian explosion, Earth was sterile, and all of a sudden you had lots of life. That's not the case. Life goes back to 4 billion years ago. There are a lot of bacteria, prokaryotes, then eukaryotic cells, and sometime before this, multicellular life started showing up, and then it greatly diversified. So it wasn't sterile at all before this. So what caused this increase in diversity? That's an area of scientific speculation, and perhaps oxygen levels got up to a certain level that could support this level of complexity, and perhaps just it was a matter of living things just getting complex enough to diversify like this. We don't really know what happened. Some examples of organisms that lived during this Cambrian period. This top left one is called Hallucigenia, and when this was named, maybe the person that named it thought that natural selection was hallucinating. This top right one looks kind of weird. The bottom left one, it was thought that it was 3 different organisms. The back part kind of reminded someone of something resembling a sea cucumber. Those mouth parts on the right look kind of like shrimp. There were some circular mouth parts that reminded some of a jellyfish. And then later it was discovered that all 3 parts fit together. The genus name for that one is Anomalocaris. It was an anomaly. It was weird. This one on the right also looks kind of weird. It's kind of hard to tell the anterior end from the posterior end. So there were a number of phyla that existed during the Cambrian time period that don't exist today. One that was present is called a trilobite. It has 3 lobes to its body, you can see, and it was an arthropod. It had jointed legs, and this was the most successful group of arthropods up until a certain point of time we'll talk about later when they went extinct. So this was a super common fossil about this time. Then about 1 billion years ago, land formed. We can see the first land life going back to 0.5 billion years or 500 million years ago. There are plants and fungi. And about 470 million years ago, we can see the first land life. And you can see some fossils here of some of this first life that moved on land. The bottom left one is called a Eurypterid. It's kind of related to scorpions, and it crawled out onto land. And that top right figure is one of some organisms living on land. And what I've described is the bottom part of this geologic timetable. The history of life on Earth, the history of the Earth can be divided into time periods. And we see the Proterozoic, the Archean, the Pre-Archean. These occurred before the Cambrian time period, which you can also see towards the bottom right. So these periods at the bottom are called the Precambrian time periods, and then you got the Cambrian time period. And these time periods are divided up by looking at their fossils, what fossils are present. And they're also divided up into extinction events. For example, about 240 million years ago, there was an extinction event called the Permian Extinction, which wiped out most life on Earth, including the trilobites. About 66 million years ago, there was another major extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, among other organisms. And so our history is divided up into different periods and eons and epochs, partly based on these extinction events, changes in the fossil record. And these extinction events, some of them are referred to as mass extinctions. Why is it a mass extinction? Because many things went extinct at the same time. And what's the most famous mass extinction event? It occurred about 65 million years ago. It wiped out all the dinosaurs except birds. Taxonomists consider birds as a type of dinosaurs. As a type of dinosaur. Not only did it wipe out most all dinosaurs, it wiped out about half of all life on Earth. What caused it? There's a good bit of geologic evidence that shows a meteor crashed into Earth about 65 million years ago. In the 1970s, a couple of geologists discovered a layer of iridium in rocks that dated to right about this time period. This iridium's a radioactive chemical that's really rare on Earth. It's more common in meteorites. It's created by nuclear explosions. And it's unusually common in rocks dating to about 65 million years old. It's unusually common there. So we dated this extinction event to about 65 million years old. There's an unusual amount of iridium. Iridium is common in meteorites. And also looking at geologic records and geologic features, it looks like a meteorite crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula about 65 million years ago. And these features were discovered in the 1990s. And there are some structures around the Yucatan Peninsula, some geologic features that create some pools of water that were probably created by this meteor impact 65 million years ago. But that wasn't the biggest extinction event. Around 250 million years or so ago, there was a Permian extinction that wiped out a lot more life, 96% of life on Earth, including trilobites. What happened? Continents were breaking up and shifting around. That may have changed weather patterns. It may have stimulated volcanic eruptions that may have changed the climate. These volcanic eruptions may have released a lot of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas that may have warmed the planet. Maybe there's a meteor impact. We really don't know for sure what happened 240 million years ago. And that's a time period between the Paleozoic, or that's a break between the Paleozoic era and the Mesozoic era. So that's a Permian extinction. The one we talked about earlier that killed off all the dinosaurs is called the Cretaceous extinction event. That happened about 66 million years ago, 65 million years ago. Right now, we're undergoing another mass extinction event. We are losing many species all at once. Many species are going extinct. Today, right now. What's causing it? Well, the environment's rapidly changing. And what's causing the environment to rapidly change right now? You guessed it, us. We are changing the environment. We're chopping down forests and growing crops. I read once that in the southeastern United States, more than 70% of our forests have been removed, and I found that kind of hard to believe. And then after I heard that, I flew from Georgia to Texas, and whenever I looked out my window, this is what I saw. Farmland. So most of our forests have been removed. They're chopped down and being removed for crops. And what are the consequences of these mass extinctions? Let's look towards, let's look at this figure. Notice towards the top of this figure, this shows a diversity of dinosaurs, and then look about 65 million years ago. Almost everything was wiped out except for birds. And then after that, look at mammals. Mammals greatly diversified because the dinosaurs were gone. Before this mass extinction event, before the dinosaurs were wiped out, mammals were mostly mouse-like and squirrel-like creatures. Then after the dinosaurs were gone, there was a radiation event, punctuated equilibrium, a great explosion of mammal diversity. What's going to happen after humans? Don't really know. There's a Discovery Channel show about that can speculate a lot. One thing that's important in the history of life on Earth is continental drift. Continents are not fixed in place. Continents move around the surface of the Earth. This was agreed upon generally by geologists as late as the 1960s. And continental drift contributed a lot to evolution. It was thought that continental drift may have contributed to the Permian extinction about 240 million years ago. The crust of the Earth is very thin. It floats on liquid rock or magma. That magma circulates, and as it circulates, it moves the crust around the surface of the Earth, and continents move. About 250 million years ago, right around the time of the Permian extinction, all the continents were together into one big one called Pangea. And then notice towards the bottom, we have India, and Antarctic in Australia, Think about where India and Australia are today. Look at that dark brown one, Eurasia. India is actually connected to Eurasia now. It moved a lot. So around 250, 240 million years ago, again around the time of the Permian Extinction, these continents started to split up and some of them moved to new environments. India was pretty close to the South Pole. Now it's north of the equator. The Antarctic moved further south and got colder. There's fossil evidence that there were dinosaurs and other organisms living in Antarctic, which is now covered in a lot of ice. And this figure starting at the top left shows how Pangea broke up and how the continents moved around. And towards the bottom right, we have present day. And as these continents moved, that greatly influenced the history of life on Earth.